we can go now live to Westminster, where the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is making a statement about the National Health Service.
About breaking open our NHS to US corporations and thus driving up the cost of medicines. You'd have seen Boris Johnson lose his cool, very angrily react by saying that it's an absolute invention, it's completely untrue. He told the country there was no circumstances whatsoever in which his government or any Conservative government would put the NHS on the table into any trade negotiations. What I have here is something I can reveal to you. "451 pages of unredacted documents and information." All of it here. His government released this. We have since obtained this, which is a very different version of events. Perhaps he'd like to explain why these documents confirm the US is demanding the NHS is on the table in the trade talks. These uncensored documents leave Boris Johnson's denials in absolute tatters. Voters need to ask themselves some very serious questions. Is the NHS safe in Boris Johnson's hands? We've now got evidence that under Boris Johnson, the NHS is on the table and will be up for sale. He tried to cover it up in his secret agenda, but today it's been exposed. Now we know the truth. When Johnson says, "Get Brexit done," it's a fraud on the British people. This is the reality. Years of bogged-down negotiations and our NHS is up for sale. This election is now a fight for the survival of our National Health Service as a public service free for all at the point of need. So for the want of any doubt, let me give this reassurance. Labour will never, ever treat our NHS as a bargaining chip in trade talks with anybody. We will never let Donald Trump get his hands on our NHS, because our NHS is not for sale. These reports cover 6 rounds of talks running from July 2017 until just a few months ago. The meetings took place in both Washington, D.C. and London. The 6 rounds should be taken as one ongoing negotiation. We're talking here about secret talks for a deal with Donald Trump after Brexit, a deal that will shape our country's future. These reports pull back on the curtain of the secrecy that's been plotted for all of us behind closed doors by this Conservative government. This is what they don't want you to know. So let me take you through some of the points that are in these reports. Let me begin with medicine pricing. Medicine pricing is obviously very important. Labour and experts said the big US corporations want to force up the price of our NHS pays for drugs as part of this toxic deal being negotiated with Trump. The Conservatives said this was nonsense. The documents show that we were right. In fact, negotiations have advanced even further than we feared they had. The US and the UK have already finished initial discussion on lengthening patents for medicines. Longer patents can mean only one thing: more expensive drugs. Lives will be put at risk as a result of this. Many out-of-patent medicines available cheaply here are vastly more expensive under patent law in the United States. The drug Humira for Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis costs our National Health Service £1,409 a packet. In the United States, the same packet costs £8,115. Get the difference. 1,409 in our NHS, 8,115 in the USA. One of the reasons for US drug prices being on average 250% higher than those here is a patent regime rigged for the big pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Andrew Hill has warned the NHS could have to hand over £500 million a week more for medicines following a toxic Trump deal. If you look at the readout of the second meeting on page 51, UK officials report that patent issues, quotes, around, quotes, NHS access to generic drugs will be a key consideration in talks. US officials have pushed hard, the report says, for longer patents for US drug companies. You can also see on page 132 of the report of the fourth meeting where drug patents are being discussed, that officials are ready to, quote, exchange text, which is trade negotiator speak for it being at a very advanced stage. And they say they're ready to, I quote, really take significant further steps. Let's be frank, the US is not going to negotiate to sell its own medicines for less. President Trump himself never tires of complaining about what he calls the unreasonably low prices other countries pay for medicines. The White House even has a web page attacking so-called foreign freeloading. That's what they're accusing our National Health Service of. Big Pharma has ripped off and imperiled the health of the American people for years. Now, these secret reports show they're looking to do the same to us if the Conservatives are elected on December the 12th. Labour has been warning that the NHS services will also be on the table in trade talks for a sellout deal with Trump. After all, that's exactly what Trump said when he visited this country in June. He said, and I quote, "When you're dealing in trade, everything is on the table, NHS or anything else." The Tories have denied it, but the documents show that, on this occasion, Trump was right, and so were we. The new breed of trade deals are not only or even mainly about tariffs on goods at the border. They're also about services, including our health service. And these documents make clear that for the US, to quote page 41 of the third meeting report, and I quote again, everything is included unless something is specifically excluded. They want, I quote, total market access as the baseline assumption of the trade negotiations. Total market access. But surely you can't believe that British officials would demand the NHS be excluded? Apparently not. In fact, on behalf of the Conservative government, officials reassured their counterparts that the US should expect the UK to be a liberalising influence, and that together they could fly the good flag for services liberalisation. That's a green light for breaking open Britain's public services so corporations can profit from them. So now we know, direct from the secret reports, that they never wanted you to see. The US is demanding that our NHS is on the table in negotiations for a toxic deal. It's already been talked about in secret. That could lead to runaway privatisation of our health service. Mega corporations see Johnson's alliance with Trump as a chance to make billions from the illness and sickness of people in this country. And if the Conservatives have their way, and this deal goes forward, the changes I've revealed will be almost irreversible. Officials have discussed a system that gives corporations the power to sue our country. This is not only a plot against our NHS, it's a plot against the whole country. These sellout negotiations with Trump cover everything from food safety to gender discrimination rules to workers' rights. I'll leave it to you journalists as experts to comb through these secret reports and expose the biggest threats. But let me give you a few pointers. How about chlorine-washed chicken on our dinner tables? Have a look at the second meeting on page 42 and 3, where the US even agrees to share its public lines to help our government with its media narratives. You might want to look at how Trump's America absolutely refuses to mention climate change in the deal. See the second meeting on page 17. And on page 1 of meeting 6, for the US advocating a no-deal Brexit, anything that would mean they'd be all to play for in a deal with Trump. What's at stake in a deal with Trump could not be more important for our country. In this election, the Conservatives want you to vote blind, keeping millions of us in the dark about what their plans actually are. But these reports, first obtained in censored form by campaigners in this room, shine a light on this plot. So it seems to me that it's now to Boris Johnson to explain how all of this is an absolute invention. You heard his words on the video we just showed. To explain why he denied the very things we can now read in black and white on paper here in this room today. He's got to come clean on what the Conservatives' sellout plans are for our National Health Service. Labour will not let this rest because, unlike the Conservatives, we're not on the side of the billionaires and the bankers. We're on the side of the nurse, the doctor, the patient and the people, and we will never sell out our National Health Service. I now ask our colleagues, friends from the National Health Service are here today to help us, and they will pass around some copies of these documents, and then Barry and I will take questions from you.
Handheld mic.
Where is it?
Handheld mic.
Can we lower the rostrum a bit?
Yeah.
Sophie, is there a hand?
Well, as you can see, copies of that document being handed out to the media, 451 pages relating to preparations for negotiating a trade deal with the United States. And Labour have got people dressed in medical scrubs there handing it out, clearly making the point that they believe the National Health Service is in danger. Well, this is probably the first major bombshell that we've had revealed during this general election campaign. Here with me to assess it is Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor. I mean, as Mr Corbyn showed, we've seen a redacted version of this, but this is the cold, hard proof.
If everybody
Absolutely. So during one of the earlier head-to-head debates, Jeremy Corbyn brandished the redacted version. This is a 451-page document. All we had until today were pages and pages of blacked-out script. Now we've got the whole thing, and it is a leak, apparently from within government, showing, he claims, the extent to which officials had been working on a trade deal that involves elements of the NHS.
Right, and now the Labour leader is taking questions. Along with him, Barry Gardiner, there, the Labour frontbencher chairing this news conference in Westminster. Let's go and listen to what's going on.
Thank you. Jeremy Corbyn, just two questions. Firstly, are you saying that any trade deal with the US would be impossible without putting the NHS on the table? And just on the issue of trust, you're suggesting to the public today that they shouldn't trust Boris Johnson on the NHS, but of course the Chief Rabbi suggested yesterday that the public shouldn't trust you to protect all minorities in this country. You didn't apologise last night over the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Is that because you think the Chief Rabbi is wrong and you haven't done anything personally wrong? Thank you.
And then Libby.
Jeremy Corbyn, you say that you're on the side of the people. Does that include Jewish people? And do you want to take this opportunity to apologise for anti-Semitic incidents in the Labour Party that have happened on your watch?
And Libby, do you have a question about the issue that we're actually discussing today, or was that just an opportune moment to get a dig in about something else?
It's not a dig.
No, it's very serious
about,
indeed. But we're here today to discuss the NHS and the trade deal.
Yeah, but
I thought, as a
Corbyn,
journalist attending this event, you might have a question about that issue, because I'm sure you'll agree that is also something of real importance to the British public.
It is of importance.
Good. So, do you have a question?
Can I ask Mr. Corbyn on the NHS whether he accepts that Donald Trump has already denied that the NHS would be on the table in any future trade talks? And what interest would a future British government have in doing a deal that effectively made medicines unaffordable in this country? Why would any government have an incentive to actually sign a trade deal that involved that kind of equation?
Okay, and Laura.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner. It's no secret that American companies want access to the UK drugs market. But in these piles and piles of documents, do you have evidence that UK ministers agreed that the health service should be part of trade talks? Because the two are different things. And just on a brief point, again, Mr. Corbyn, you were given the opportunity last night several times to apologise to the Jewish community. One of your shadow ministers, Nia Griffiths, has said that the Labour Party should apologise to the Jewish community. Have you changed your mind this morning about saying that?
Okay. Jeremy.
Thank you for your questions. I made it very clear anti-Semitism is completely wrong within our society. Our party did make it clear when I was elected leader and after that anti-Semitism was unacceptable in any form in our party or our society, and did indeed offer its sympathies and apologies to those that had suffered, and the party set up a process in which I proposed that be a strong process, and I proposed an even stronger process at the National Executive in July, which was agreed by the party conference and was therefore is now part of our rules. And people who commit any acts of anti-Semitism are rapidly dealt with in the party. It affects 0.001% of the party membership, and we are saying one is one too many. And I acknowledge what the Chief Rabbi said yesterday. I would also point out that very large numbers of other people in the Jewish community have made it very clear that they do support Labour, that they do recognise my absolute commitment that every community in our country will be safe under a Labour government, and that we will work with every community in this country to ensure their safety, protection of synagogues, mosques and temples, schools, cemeteries, and anything else that affects the life of a particular community. We've made that abundantly clear, and I will continue to make that clear, because we have to be one society. We have to work together to defeat the rise of the far right and the scourge of racism within our society. And that is exactly why we published our Race and Faith Manifesto yesterday, which made that very clear in relation to all communities. Abuse of a Jewish family on a train is vile and wrong. Abuse of a Muslim woman walking down the street is vile and wrong. None of it is acceptable, and none of it will ever be acceptable, either within our party, by our party, or by a government that I would be proud to lead, that would be the most anti-racist government you've ever seen, because that is what I've spent my whole life doing, fighting against racism. And I will die fighting against racism in any form. It's a poison and a scourge. The other points that have been raised, Barry will answer some of them, on the National Health Service. If you want to know whether ministers were involved in these talks or not, then they sanctioned the talks. They're obviously fully aware of the talks, and they're the ones that were declining to make the documents published and public in the first place.
Indeed, they led the talks from the start. And we know that George Hollenbury has been involved in those talks as a government minister. So, yes. Look, in effect, there are four ways in which a trade deal can... most of the questions revolved around the same issue, so let me try and deal with it. there are 4 ways in which a trade deal can undermine our NHS. By the way in which disputes are settled, by what is included or excluded, which is sometimes called the negative list system, by the patenting regime that is adopted, and that's the importance of extending the life of those drugs so that the drug companies can gain more money from those patented drugs without the use of generics. And the 4th way is indirectly through the data regime, which we in the NHS have the best data in the world. It's been collected the longest, and it's the most comprehensive. And so big pharmaceutical companies want to get that data in order to be able to produce more drugs that they can then patent and sell back to us. And the control of that data regime is incredibly important as well. So all of these things are the ways in which a trade negotiation, a free trade agreement, can impact on our health services in this country. Did you want to specifically take... Yeah, okay, let me go to... Well, if I can take the further band of 3. I've got Paul Wall, then Toby back there from Channel 4, and then Pippa Crerar from the Mirror.
Paul Ward, is this working? Mr Corbyn, given what you've outlined today, are you also suggesting that a Labour government would legislate to stop any of these trade practices happening? Would you legislate to protect data in the NHS? Would you legislate to make sure, for example, that there is no power to sue the NHS and that there is no power to engage in services liberalisation? And a second one, can I just ask, you've always said that this election is not about you, but do you agree with Lord Kerslake then that he was right to suggest that your leadership would actually be part of a conversation with Liberal Democrats and the SNP in the event of any hung parliament?
Okay, and then Toby.
Victoria MacDonald from Channel 4 News. 2 questions. I didn't quite understand your reasoning on the trade talks, because isn't it the case in any trade talks that the Americans, for instance, would put everything they want on the table, and it's up to the British government to then negotiate a way to a position that they want? Secondly, Mr Corbyn, you've taken a neutral stance on Brexit, but isn't it the case that if there was no Brexit, this wouldn't even be on the table? We wouldn't have a forest of papers sitting on our knees now, because we wouldn't have to negotiate a trade talk.
And Pippa.
Thank you. Pippa Crerar from the Daily Mirror. Just on the climate change aspect of the trade talks, I mean, the point made by the US in these documents is that the US Congress decided in 2015 that there'll be no mention of greenhouse gas emissions reductions in trade agreements, and the trade emissary suggests that that ban won't be lifted anytime soon. So how does Labour, given it's sort of a US legal issue, how would Labour get around that and make sure that climate change and greenhouse emissions were on the table? And then specifically, Mr Corbyn, can I ask, was yesterday the worst day of your campaign so far?
I love everyday campaigning, and yesterday was another day that I loved, because I go out all the time, meeting people, listening to people, understanding what people's fears and concerns are, and I'm horrified at the levels of inequality, poverty and injustice that have come in Britain since austerity came in 2010, and I'm utterly determined to win this election, to end austerity, provide homes for the homeless, and end the disgraceful levels of child poverty in this country. And that is the message that I carry out all across the country. And I'll be doing that today and every day up till December the 12th. On Paul's question, there are no talks with any other parties. We're fighting this election to win it. We're not fighting to form a coalition. We're not fighting it to do a deal with other parties. We're fighting it proudly as the Labour Party on our manifesto. And I hope we move into government on December the 13th to start righting some of the wrongs and injustices that austerity has brought to this country, and I'm proud of the manifesto on which we're fighting the election. On the point about trade talks, and Barry will deal with this as well, and the point that Vicky made about no deal. Well, it's Boris Johnson that has tried to threaten a no-deal exit from the European Union and keeps on pivoting to say that he would do a special trade deal with the United States. And I think these documents show the nature of those talks. And when talks reach a point where they're exchanging texts, it sounds to me like they're getting awfully near to some form of agreement and the dangers that go with it. Our strategy, as you know, is that within 3 months we'll negotiate an agreement with the European Union so that we do have market access to Europe and we protect the Good Friday Agreement, and within 6 months we'll put that to a referendum alongside Remain. So there will be an option to leave the European Union but not wreck all our very important trading relationships with Europe, or to remain within the European Union. That is a way of bringing people together, and our party is determined that that will be what we will do in government. The points about the legislation that we would introduce or the system we would adopt are quite simply this: we will not accept the idea that there is investor protection in the way in which trade deals are run. We would also make sure, and Barry will speak on this because he's been very central to developing our green industrial revolution, that protection of the environment would be absolutely part of our trade arrangements as well, because clearly every department of government has to play its part in getting us to net zero emissions as quickly as we possibly can.
If I can just pick up on the issues around dispute settlement, which was one of the key areas in which the NHS can face undermining by trade agreements. You asked the question as to how we would counter those elements. We have said very clearly that we would not accept what are known as the ISDS, the Interstate Disputes Settlement procedures, or the ICS, which are the new court system which some more modern trade agreements have adopted. We would not accept those because they enable foreign companies to undermine public policy in this country if we wanted to take measures to say that, for example, in countries where plain paper packaging for cigarettes has been adopted, those countries have been sued by tobacco companies for introducing that. So we believe it's right that public policy health measures should be in the domain of the British government, not subject to legal dispute in separate courts that only foreign countries have access to, foreign companies have access to, that can then undermine health policy in the UK. That's absolutely central to what we've said. The government has refused to adopt that position repeatedly in debate in the House of Commons, in the committee when the trade bill was going through. And in a similar vein, we've also said that we wouldn't accept the negative list procedure. And again, that's important because on a negative list, effectively what you're saying is everything is open to competition. All services are open to competition except those that are specifically mentioned in the agreement. Now, of course, what that does is it does not enable you to future-proof your system. What about new treatments, new services that are discovered, constantly happening in medicine? They would be open to competition straight away, instead of being able to be directly provided by the NHS. So these are the ways in which we have adopted a very clear position. We will not allow the dispute settlement processes. We will not allow the negative list system. And the interesting thing is many other countries are now moving towards that position in trade agreements. If you look at New Zealand, for example, they've already done that with regard to ISDS procedures and said that they would not accept. In fact, they've pulled out of some sections of trade agreements where that's occurred. So that I think answers the questions that you put.
Can I just add to that
please.
on generic medicines? We announced at our party conference a policy of extending the provision of generic medicines within the NHS, particularly where the patents have been obtained by a pharmaceutical company, but there's been a very big public contribution towards the research costs of those medicines. Now, I recognise research in medicines is expensive, but we also recognise that the patents go on for a very long time, and these documents indicate why that is, in order to actually falsely keep medicine prices up. And so we will also be rolling out during the term of the Labour government a manufacturing facility for the NHS to manufacture its own generic medicines, which again would make the medicine supply cheaper. Many people who use the NHS, I'm sure everyone in this room uses the NHS, are completely unaware of the prices the NHS pays for medicines, because the NHS is quite rightly free at the point of need. And we're just pointing out that our strategy and our policy will reduce medicine costs in the NHS. Everything in these documents that I've revealed to you this morning indicates that a trade deal with the United States would actually increase the length of patent time and increase the prices that our NHS has to pay for medicines in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other aspect of that is that when these documents talk about full access, what that also means is that NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, is precisely what they want to undermine. It's that capacity to control what NICE is able to do, and to make sure that our medicines are cost effective. They don't want that, and when they talk about full access, that's what they're referring to. Often in trade language, it's very covert what is being said, because they dress it up in convoluted ways, and you have to actually understand what these phrases mean. Full access means no NICE. I've now got...
You prefer Barry Gardiner negotiating on behalf of this country than Boris Johnson? Just saying.
Could I get Harry York from The Telegraph, then Kylie McClellan from Reuters, and Jim Pickard from the FT. So, Harry, first of all.
Thank you. Barry, I just wanted to get some clarity from you. You were asked several times if you had firm evidence that ministers had effectively said that the NHS is up for sale. Could we just have some clarity on that, yes or no?
Kylie?
Kylie McClellan from Reuters. You've talked about the NHS not being up for sale under a Labour government, but would you also look to reverse any existing privatisations, and would there be any kind of legal or cost implications involved in that?
Thank you. And Jim.
Mr. Corbyn, it was clear from last night's interview that the promise not to raise taxes on people earning less than £80,000 isn't quite true. Are you going to advise colleagues to stop saying that there won't be any tax rises for people earning less than £80,000?
Do you want to do those two, and I'll take...
Yeah, sure. The Grey Book that we produced is very clear. There will be no tax or national insurance increases for anyone earning less than £80,000 a year. Our tax increases will be in corporation tax and will be for those at the highest end of the income bracket in this country. We will raise corporation tax to no higher than 26%, which is what it was, which is lower than it was in 2010. In fact, is less than many other industrial countries. And I think if you look at the scale of need around the country, in the National Health Service, in social care, in education, in housing, in the levels of poverty that so many of our children have been brought up in, you would accept that it is only right that we adopt this programme and this policy in order to try and redress some of the awful levels of inequality that have developed in Britain since austerity came in 2010. On the point about privatisation within the NHS, the Health and Social Care Act, which went through after the coalition of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives went into office in 2010, specifically encourages the operations of the private sector within the National Health Service. It has grown considerably over the past 9 years, and as long as that act is in place, will continue to grow. And we have the absurd prospect at the present time of private medical companies suing the NHS for contracts they don't get for services they're not allowed to run. I mean, this, to me, is unbelievable that a private sector organisation thinks it ought to run a service, doesn't get the contract, and therefore sues the NHS for not getting it. Every penny they sue the NHS for, every penny the NHS has to spend on legal fees defending itself is taken away from patient needs, taken away from those people that are waiting for operations, waiting in A&E departments. And I want to change that. I want to end that part of the Health and Social Care Act and instead start reversing that process to bring the private services currently operating within the NHS back into the family of the NHS. So everyone working for the NHS is an NHS employee working together as one community rather than this miasma of different companies running different parts of hospitals and all the administrative problems that come from that. Our party is determined to defend and rejuvenate our NHS because that is what we're determined to achieve.
If I can just pick up on, and my apologies, I can't remember whether it was Victoria Pippa that mentioned about climate change.
It was Pippa.
Pippa, I didn't respond to that when I should have. The way in which we want to deal with this in trade agreements is very clear. What we've done in this country is we've reduced our emissions over the past decade and more. But we've done that in large measure by exporting some of those emissions so that we're now importing goods that have been produced abroad and the emissions are being produced over there. And what we need to do, particularly in trade agreements, is to ensure that we're not simply consuming the emissions that we've offshored. If you take a particularly topical example, it would be in the trade talks with Mercosur over Bolsonaro's Brazilian government burning the Amazon in order to clear it to produce beef and soy, which they can then sell into European markets. Now, it seems to me that if we have a robust policy on climate change, we should not then be negotiating trade agreements which are accepting that beef and soy that is being produced from deforested rainforest. So it's really trying to have a joined up, a comprehensive look at the way in which trade agreements impact on all our policies, whether it's the National Health Service or whether it's our climate change policies, and trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing at all levels. Harry, you asked for firm evidence about ministerial involvement and whether...
Jeremy Corbyn and Labour's trade spokesman Barry Gardiner there following a news conference where they revealed a 451 pages of documents relating to trade negotiations with the United States, concentrating on the NHS, and the Labour press office have confirmed that the people handing out the document wearing medical scrubs are indeed employees of the National Health Service. Well, with me is our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We're here to cover the launch of